It's hard not to like Zechariah. I mean, he and his wife Elizabeth were old and childless. And in those days, if you were old and childless, it pretty much means that you have absolutely no means of support in your old childlessness. Yeah. It's a problem. And Elizabeth and Zechariah had apparently been praying for a long time to have a child, but had more or less given up hope. And Zechariah, we don't talk about him very much. The story of Zechariah tends to be overshadowed by the story of the angel appearing to Mary. We talk about that all the time. We've turned Mary's song into a song called the Magnificat that shows up all the time everywhere. But when's the last time we sang Zechariah's song? So he's one of these minor characters, and after Jesus is born, he's never mentioned again, but he's got a pretty neat story. And of course, Zechariah and Elizabeth have a special place in my heart because I kind of got in trouble once for preaching a sermon about Zach and Liz in seminary that was it's a long story. I'll tell you the story of Zach and Liz one of these days, but not right now. So a long time ago, just over 2,000 years ago now, in a galaxy far, far away, okay, it was just in Jerusalem, but everything is Star Wars, so I figured I'd jump on the bandwagon. Zechariah was a priest. He was descended from Abijah, which is one of the higher priestly families. He was a faithful follower of God, and like I said, he and his wife Elizabeth had no children. One day, it was Zechariah's turn to go into the temple. And not just into the temple, but into the temple. The Holy of Holies, the most holy place, the place where nobody went to. And when you went in there, you were always slightly afraid that you would touch something wrong and be struck down. I mean, this is a rather long-standing thing. And so Zechariah's in there, about to light the incense on the altar of God. And can you just imagine going up one day and lighting a candle, and then looking to your right and seeing an angel? That'd be something else, right? Especially seeing as angels are pretty scary. There's a reason why the first thing angels always say is, "Don't be afraid." But the angel appeared and said, "Hey, guess what? You and your wife are going to have a son, and you're going to name him John. He's going to bring people back to the Lord and even go before the Lord to make the people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah was somewhat understandably puzzled by this, and he more or less said to the angel, "You're kidding, right?" The angel's response was, "I don't kid, I'm Gabriel. And now you're not going to talk until the child's born." So Zechariah didn't talk until the child was born. But there's an interesting little scene in the middle here that we skipped over entirely. See, there's this one line. "Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple." Remember how I told you that he was going into the most holy place, the place where God himself lives? Now, if you've ever read the Old Testament, there's a couple bits where people accidentally touch something that God told them not to touch because he lives there. And when somebody touches something that God told them not to touch because he lives there, they immediately die. And now there's an interesting tradition that is almost probably false, but it's really fun. As part of the high priest's uniform, there are bells. Just little bells, little jingly jangly bells. Now, there again, long-standing tradition, absolutely no basis in fact, that part of something else that the high priests went into the most holy of holies with was a rope tied to their ankle. Long-standing tradition, no basis in fact. And the thinking was, if the high priest were to do something wrong, the bells would stop jingling, and then they'd have a way to get the high priest's body out. Again, I actually talked to a Messianic Jew friend of mine about this particular tradition, and his response basically was, if they went into the Holy of Holies with a rope tied around them, it not being part of the prescribed priestly articles, he would have been struck down for having a rope on him. But it's kind of fun. There is a justifiable fear of the people, though, that Zechariah, while he was in the Holy of Holies, did something wrong and God punished him because he was in there a lot longer than it takes to light a couple candles. Luckily for everyone, Zechariah ended up coming out and he was mute, and somehow he carried on serving at the temple in his muteness until his term of service was over and he went back home. And 9 months after he got home, John was born. There was also a little bit of a scene in there about 6 months on where Elizabeth's cousin shows up, but, we all know that story. So, John is born. Immediately after, there's the whole kerfuffle with the name, saying, what are you going to name him John for? Nobody in your family's named John. You should name him Zechariah. And the very first thing Zechariah says is a prophecy. He writes down his name is John, but the first thing he says is that God is going to save his people out of the line of David, and my child John is going to be the one to tell everyone about him. He is going to be the one to prepare the way for the Lord, who will give his people salvation, show mercy, and enable us to serve him in holiness and righteousness for all our days. It's a really neat prophecy about John the Baptist. And it's very fitting for us to be talking about on this fourth Sunday of Advent, just a few days before we celebrate Jesus' birth. Because that's exactly what Luke does. We get a visit to Zechariah and a visit to Mary, John being born, Jesus being born. The miraculous events leading to John's birth lead us right into the even more miraculous events of Jesus' birth. And the curious events surrounding John's conception lead us right into the curious events surrounding Jesus' conception. But there's another part of this story that's important, and namely, it's what John's job is. Even at the very beginning, it's made very clear that John, who will later be known as the Baptist, will have the spirit and power of Elijah on him to prepare the hearts and minds of the people for the coming of Jesus. You'll notice in the Gospels that once Jesus shows up, John starts to fade into the background. Once Jesus gets baptized, the next time we hear about John is that he died at some point before the time that we're hearing about John's death is. John's whole job is to prepare the people for Jesus to show up. And that's our job too. Now, one of the things that makes me very happy to be a Lutheran pastor and not another kind of pastor is that our faith in God is not something that we have on our own, but is something that God gives us. For one, it makes me a lot less stressed out because I know that faith isn't something that I have to do, it's something that God gives me. There is nothing about our salvation that we do for ourselves. And I love this about Lutheran theology, but it has a problem. Because it can very easily lead to us thinking that we don't need to tell anyone about Jesus because God does all the work of salvation anyways. Luckily, Jesus answers this in one of his parables because he compares the process of knowing God to the process of growing a plant. Now, we all know how good I am at growing plants. I'm not. But I know the mechanics of it all, right? So you need some dirt, and then you put a seed in the dirt, and then you water the dirt, and eventually a plant shows up. Isn't that about how it works? I know I'm extremely simplifying here, but that's, sure, you can put fancy stuff in there, but short version, right? That's how the plant grows. Do I control the growth of the plant? but can I cause the plant to not grow? I can't make it grow, but I can sure make it not grow. So the process of faith, someone has to plant the seed, someone waters it, someone does all the other stuff that you have to do to grow. Plant metaphor fails me every time. But this is part of the process that we prepare people for Christ. Paul in Romans makes this even more clear because right after he spells out, this is what you have to do to be saved. You confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. That's what you have to do to be saved. But then he says, who can call on someone they haven't believed in? Who can believe in someone that they've never heard about? Who can hear about someone if no one's preaching it? And who can preach unless they've been sent out to preach? It's the exact same process. And it answers this problem that we sometimes have as Lutherans, thinking that if God is the one that does the saving, that we don't have to tell anyone about Jesus. We are called to spread the good news of salvation just like John was. It's our job to prepare the hearts around us for Jesus, just like John did. In fact, it's the last command that Jesus gives his disciples, to go out and tell folk about him. We are the ones who are now, like John the Baptist, sent to proclaim the good news. We're the ones that the people around us will listen to. And if we aren't preaching who Jesus is, if we aren't preparing the way for him, how will anyone hear? And if they don't hear what we are preaching, how will anyone believe? And if they don't believe, how will they call on the name of the Lord and be saved? That is our call, to be like John the Baptist and prepare the way of the Lord.